Good evening, everyone. It's joy. It's a joyous thing to be in this beautiful space. There's not a bad space in this library. It's absolutely beautiful, and a testament to what can be done when we corral public resources on behalf of all of us. And so I'm honored to be here, honored to be asked to participate, and thankful to Loyalty Books and to the DC Public Library. So, Richard, this is interesting because, as was just mentioned, you wrote a book that shared a history that you said is not necessarily hidden, but is not spoken of, written about. And I think you pierced some of the narratives we tell ourselves about ourselves. So you taught us that residential segregation was created by intentional policy to ensure that blacks and whites live separately. And the book had an enormous impact, over 1 million copies sold, and we're hoping this book will do the same or more. But since The Color of Law came out, we've had all kinds of demonstrations, people pushing up against the most egregious aspects of the American imperium, and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and so many other things, not only happening here, but happening globally. I think it's important to give that context. With the success of The Color of Law and the shifting conversation around race and economics, why did you feel the need to write another book that helps to answer the what's next question?
Well, thank you, Reverend Lamar. The reason I felt the need is because people kept on asking me that question. You know, the Color of Law demonstrated that the notion of de facto segregation was a myth. There was no reality to it whatsoever. The reason, as you said, that we are segregated in every metropolitan area of this country is because of racially explicit government policy, federal, state, and local, designed to ensure that blacks and whites could live near one another anywhere. The important point about that fact is that we have an unconstitutional system of residential segregation because government created it, not private individuals. Of course, there's private bigotry, there's a lot of it. We're aware of it all the time. But if government had fulfilled its constitutional responsibilities, it wouldn't be allowed to flourish. So we have an unconstitutional system of residential segregation in violation of the 5th, 13th, and 14th Amendments to the Constitution in particular. And since we have an unconstitutional system, all of us, every one of us as Americans, has an obligation to fix it. If it was de facto segregation, if it just happened by accident, we could go along in life thinking we'll have to wait until it unhappens by accident. But since it's a violation of our Constitution, and we all take our responsibilities as American citizens seriously, we have an obligation to fix it. So people ask me what we can do about it. I thought that there's no political will in this country at this point to make big national change. But I realized that once the federal government and other levels of government created an apartheid system, it's sustained and reinforced and perpetuated by local programs and policies that are easy to address if people simply organize in local committees to do so. And as you said, we had 20 million Americans participated in Black Lives Matter demonstrations after the murder of George Floyd. They were suburban and urban, white and black, young and old. It was the most diverse outpouring of support for racial justice in this country's history. The largest demonstration, if you add it all up, 20 million Americans ever. And yet most of the people who participated in those demonstrations then went home and they put Black Lives Matter signs on their lawns or in their windows and didn't know what to do further. So I thought it would be a good idea to help them understand what they could do, because there's so much that can be done. And I decided to recruit a co-author, and I found the most talented, able co-author in the country. Leah joined me in this effort, and this book that we've written, Just Action, describes dozens of different actions that can be taken by organized groups and local communities to redress segregation. Every one will make a small difference, but when you add them all up, you could really make a significant difference in creating a more racially egalitarian society.
So one of the things I appreciate about the book, even the photographs, you're telling stories, human stories. You take a narrative approach, because we could easily get lost in the policy and in the history. But the way you both weave the story, you remind us that human beings are impacted. Human beings are challenged by this segregated housing regime. So I want to ask you both, I'll begin with you, Leah. You did scores of interviews. So one of the appendices in the book lists all the people you interviewed for each chapter, and I was tired reading the names. So I want to ask you, as you recall interviewing these persons, whose face do you remember? Whose voice, whose story resonates with you as you sit here in the MLK Library in Washington, D.C.?
Wow, so many. I think that, we used these photographs and stories not just to tell the impact, but to show what it takes to challenge segregation, and to show that there are people all over the country doing things in their own communities and having success. And we wanted to tell those stories and also show them. So the pictures are meant to illustrate what it looks like to take local action, what it looks like to be successful in some of these endeavors. We outline, and when we say this, I hope it doesn't sound completely boring, that we outline dozens and dozens of strategies and policies that a local group can take on. But for all of them, we tell a story about a group that's working on one of those things, or that has successfully implemented one of them. I guess right now, one that's standing out in my mind is because we went to take the picture ourselves, because it was someone near where we live in California, a woman who's a paralegal in a community north of the Bay Area and couldn't afford to live in her community. She worked for the city government, and as a result of an inclusionary housing policy, which required that as new development was built in this community, some of the units were reserved to be sold or rented at affordable prices to lower and moderate income households. And these inclusionary units, so this brings together a few examples of policies from the book. So there were inclusionary units that were then given to a land trust to manage their long-term affordability. And this woman bought one of the units and lived there with her daughter and 2 granddaughters. And because they could now live in the community where she worked, she had a shorter commute, and her daughter could get a job nearby, and her granddaughters got to go to higher quality schools in their neighborhood. And so we got to go meet them and take pictures of them at this new housing development. So that's what's standing out. But there's all sorts of stories like that from the book.
It's like having to pick a favorite child.
Right. Well.
You already did that. Yeah. For you, Richard?
Sure. We begin the book by describing the necessity of creating biracial and multi-ethnic committees of activists who will, and their supporters. Not everybody's going to be an activist, but many more people will be supporters, who can engage in the kinds of campaigns that can create the kinds of things that Leah was just talking about. And so I think we begin the book with a young woman, of course everybody's young to me, but a young woman in Chicago, a photographer, who, Chicago, as you know, may know, is a very segregated city, like all cities, but very segregated. The north side is white, the south side is black. What she did was she started to take photographs of houses on the north side and the south side that were pretty identical in their geography and sometimes in their outer appearance.
The map twins, right?
Yes, yes. And she called them map twins, identical houses, one on the north side occupied by a white household, on the south side occupied by a black household. And then she knocked on their doors and said, "Do you want to meet your map twin?" And many of them said yes. And she set up meetings between these people who had whites who had never been to the south side of Chicago, blacks who had never been to the north side of Chicago. She set up meetings. She required, as part of the Map Twins program, that they invite each other to their homes. They began to get to know each other better. They found out that they had a lot in common. They eventually created block twins, where they gathered their neighbors as part of this. And they began to think about how they can take action to bring what they have now discovered about their human potential to the rest of the community. Another case in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. There are 6 Presbyterian churches. 3 are all white, 3 are all black. The black churches are all on the black side of town, the white churches are all on the white side of the town. They knew nothing about each other. As a result of some publicity around racial violence in the country, the ministers decided to have lunch together and see what they could do. And one of the ministers, one of the black ministers, says, "I'm tired of just, meeting and talking about this stuff with white people. I'm not going to join you unless there's an agreement in advance that we're going to do something, not just talk about it." So they created something called, and this can be done in any community, they created something called the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue. They created a committee of 40 people. 20 had to be from the white churches, 20 had to be from the black churches. If somebody dropped out, they busy or couldn't, they had to be replaced by a same race person to maintain the racial balance of the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue. They began to meet, have social events, invite each other to each other's homes. It took a long time for that to happen. They had ice cream socials and parties, and eventually they began to score some victories, to take action like the black minister had insisted upon. They forced the city to create a civilian review board to monitor police activity. They forced the school district to change its curriculum to give more highlighting to African American achievements. And they eventually built 3 Habitat for Humanity homes, all with their volunteer labor of these Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue members for lower income African American families in that community. Now, these are very modest activities. They're not the kind of confrontational activities that we later talk about in the book, but this is how they get started. These people, neither the Map Twins nor the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue, had the benefit of professional organizers who could help them strategize and develop activities for more significant actions, but they made an important start, and we think these kinds of things are a model for many, many people elsewhere in the country.
So as you said, you started the book off talking about interracial coalitions, persons getting to know one another, and I appreciate how you have textured your comments thus far, that we're talking about moving beyond sentimentality. So we have a type of environment where we become self-congratulatory when we have diversity. And later in the book, you talk about how diversity is not going to cut it. It's not going to make the difference that we need to make. So that is a tall order to bring us together. And by the way, you also mentioned, we talk a lot, I didn't write the book, you guys talk a lot about black and white in the book, and understanding that the nation is much more diverse, but fundamentally these issues were unleashed at a time when really anti-blackness is the core of this. You come from the Bay Area. We live in the DC metropolitan area, and these are, in my thinking, self-described, self-congratulatory bastions of liberalism. But when you pull back the covers, when you scratch beneath the surface, our professed liberalism ain't that liberal. It seems to be ruggedly capitalistic. It seems to be, in a very sticky way, anti-black, anti-poor. How do we begin to move beyond the sentimentality and well-educated, diverse bastions of self-congratulatory liberalism like we find, and feigned progressivism like we find in cities like Washington and places like the Bay Area?
Well, I think one way is learning this history.
Mm.
It's a lot harder to defend your position in opposition to affordable housing or in opposition to these kinds of advances we're talking about. You know, people defend their opposition to these things by thinking or saying that, you know, this is just how it is, it just happened naturally, or I'm entitled to this because, you know, I live in this exclusive community because I deserve to, and once you can break that down by showing the explicit history, like The Color of Law showed, that no, it didn't happen by accident. It's not a natural occurrence that this community looks this way. It looks this way because of policy after policy by all level of government that created it to look that way. And the benefit that the people get from living in those exclusive communities come at the expense of the people who are excluded. So I have an example. We have a Substack column that we're continuing to write about these stories like the, you know, stories from across the country and updating things in the book. And so I wrote a column there because this happened since we finished writing the book, but a community, very exclusive, expensive, mostly white community in Silicon Valley, near where we live. It's where Facebook was founded and where Google is, you know, expensive community, not a place you would expect to be on the forefront of, you know, challenging segregation. And a group there formed when they read The Color of Law and they saw the pieces in there about their region, about the Silicon Valley region, and started to investigate and developed a workshop that explained exactly how their region came to be segregated, the policies that were responsible, the government agencies responsible, and they took this workshop around the community, did it at Rotary clubs and school districts, to parents and students, and they built a base of supporters that joined their organization, and to join they had to agree to the values of inclusion and diversity and increasing affordable housing opportunities in their community. Median home prices in this community are over $2 million, so
Wow.
it's not an easy place for anybody to buy into, but the people, you know, who live there understand that. And so while this group was forming, this local school district proposed to build 90 units of affordable housing on a vacant school site it owned for teachers. Because teachers couldn't afford to live in this community either. 30% of the workforce in their schools left every year because they couldn't afford to live anywhere near where they taught. So 90 units was their first attempt to address this. And neighbors, not surprisingly, opposed this, and they put a measure on the ballot that would have made this development illegal and any future multifamily development basically impossible. It would require a vote of the people to build affordable housing in the future in this community. So it would be an uphill battle. So this group was already formed, already talking about the history, understanding how their community came to be this way. And they launched a campaign to defeat the measure. They went door to door, they talked to their neighbors, and I talked to leaders of this campaign, and they told me, you know, they would walk up to a house and look at it and think, this person is not gonna support us, they're not gonna be on our side. And they would knock on the door and start to talk to them and realize that they did share the same values. You know, they were concerned about the teachers, their kids' teachers not being able to live in the community, their kids not being able to afford to live there, their favorite stores and cafes were closing because service employees couldn't live there. And so they ended up defeating this ballot measure, which sort of against all odds, right? They won, and now they have this even larger group of neighbors and residents who are galvanized and ready to, and strategizing what to do next. So, yeah, it is possible to counter that opposition.
Richard, you want to add anything?
Not to this, no.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great job, right?
Yeah.
So you talk about land trusts, Section 8 mobility, zoning reform, intentional desegregation of communities like Oak Park, Illinois. These are the strategies that can reverse what you talked about in The Color of Law. I just place those remedies before you. Choose one and share, or maybe one that I may not have mentioned that you may want to elaborate upon.
Sure, I'll take the first one. I'll talk about land trusts. So we talk about strategies that, to redress segregation, we need to both deal with the consequences of segregation and ensure that we don't continue to create and perpetuate segregated communities. So one way of doing that is through a land trust. It sort of can do all of these things. A land trust usually operates in communities where housing prices are rising, so gentrifying communities often, and it attempts to preserve affordable home ownership opportunities in those communities and prevent some displacement as housing prices are rising. So we talk about a group in Durham, North Carolina that formed a land trust after neighbors just started organizing, going door to door and talking to each other. Their first step was advocating to turn a vacant lot in their neighborhood into a park, and they won, and then that got the group galvanized even more, and they learned about a land trust. Their community was gentrifying. They started with 2 properties. And the way a land trust works is a land trust will sell a home to a lower or moderate income household for an affordable price because the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the house. And so by taking the land out of the equation, the home is more affordable. And then when those homeowners go to sell their house, when they're moving on, they have to adhere to a maximum resale price that somewhat limits the equity they can build in that home ownership experience, but ensures that the new home buyer gets an affordable price as well. So in this Durham Land Trust, they now have 300 properties, some rental, some home ownership. Homes that they sell in their portfolio are now $150,000 compared to homes in the surrounding neighborhood that are $500,000. Blocks where they have properties are still mostly African American, while other surrounding blocks are mostly white. So this is an example of a community that just started small and built up this big institution that now provides long-term affordable housing in this community. Now that's an example of a land trust in a gentrifying community, but a land trust can also be used in an exclusive suburban community if that community can provide or offer or donate land to a land trust. So what it would take is residents of that suburban community organizing and advocating that their local government donate vacant land to a land trust to create affordable home ownership opportunities in communities for African Americans who have been historically excluded from those communities. And there isn't a lack of opportunity. Many local governments are sitting on vacant land. We have some examples in Modesto, California. The town now owns a golf course that went out of business. In Woodbridge, Connecticut, they own a country club. The town owns a country club that went out of business. And a lot of, like in the Silicon Valley town I talked about, a lot of suburban communities have unused school sites because public school enrollment is going down. And so all of these are opportunities, if there were a local group advocating for it, that the local government could donate that unused land to a land trust and create affordable home ownership opportunities there.
Richard, before you jump in, if I may, for fellow citizens of the region, there's this place called RFK and Stadium, and there's land adjacent called Reservation 13 near the jail. And you talk a lot about political will. Now, I'm just gonna guess, I'm not a betting man, but that our political leaders will find tax dollars to subsidize the very wealthy owners of the sports team. Is anybody with me? So that they can do what they do there. And the studies that I have read say that when we invest our dollars there, that people never get the return that they are promised. When we talk about building political will, what if that land, and there are people here who are part of Washington Interfaith Network and others, our vision is to build the kind of political will to make sure that these small swaths of public land here are used for those who need it most and who have been disinvested in. But Richard, help us. Give us something here that's going to help us make sure that RFK doesn't fall into the hands of the...
I don't know. How many of you participated in Black Lives Matter demonstrations in 2020? All right. There's your base of a local movement that could actually press for the kind of change that you're talking about. You can have, once you have two groups of people who are in different circumstances, in this country, African Americans and whites in particular, any policy that you implement, race neutral, doesn't have to be a racial policy. Any policy you implement is going to affect those two groups differently. And that's why I say that there are so many opportunities to, in a local community, to take action around policies that have a disparate impact not that are racially explicit, we don't have those anymore, but that have a disparate impact on African Americans and reinforce segregation. So I'll give you one example. In DC, in Maryland, and Virginia, and everywhere in the country, there are very few exceptions. You may be surprised to hear this. African American homeowners pay property taxes at a higher rate than white homeowners. That is, they pay property taxes, their property tax rate is a higher ratio of the market value of their homes than for white homeowners. Well, why does that happen? It's not because the property tax assessment system or the assessors are going around being racist. It's because, for example, if you don't do annual reassessments, and most communities in the country don't do annual reassessments, visually reassessing property, homes in white neighborhoods typically appreciate in value faster than homes in black neighborhoods. What that means is the assessed value of the home in a black neighborhood is closer to its market value than the assessed value of a home in a white neighborhood, which is farther below the market value. It's a discriminatory, in effect system. Homeowners in those black neighborhoods who've been paying property taxes at an excessive rate are owed refunds. A local campaign could demand refunds for those African American homeowners and increase their wealth by granting them those refunds, and also increasing their ability to stay in their homes by lowering their property taxes. So that's one example. I could go on and on. We do dozens of these in the book, and Lee can go on and on even more than I can.
You talk a lot about housing, of course. We're talking about segregation. But you dispel the myth that all African Americans are low income. And I think it's important to say that there are as many ways to be African American and or black as there are to be white or anything else. But you also talk about the fact that there are other ways to address this besides home ownership. So I work with many of you in this room, and we know that home ownership is thorny. It's not a panacea. So you talk about free community college, you talk about universal health care, you talk about a real inheritance tax. So in the District of Columbia, and I only know this because someone shared it with me, 0.4% of the population owns half the wealth. 0.4% of the citizens own half the wealth. And that is not the will of God or meritocracy, that is policy. And that kind of policy, there is no excuse for that kind of accumulation other than we have the best government that the donor class can buy. You talk about essentially redistribution. Say more about other economic ways to try to alleviate this. And just one more caveat. As I kept reading, I began to substitute segregation. It became almost a euphemism or an avatar for white hegemonic control. Like the way that you change this is to mix black and white bodies together, because maybe then the government would see these non-persons, because they're in contact with persons, they might do what they ought to do for all citizens. But help me with a vision beyond home ownership.
Well, I'll start with home ownership.
Okay.
Because while it's no panacea, there are a lot of ways that it could be a better tool for wealth building for African Americans than it is today. One example is my dad talked about unfair, disparate property tax assessments. So what happens in a lot of African American communities when property taxes are, when they're paying, more than their fair share of property taxes, and they fall behind on a property tax payment, in many jurisdictions, those unpaid property taxes are then sold to investors in a bidding auction. They buy this debt that is owed to the city or the county for a small amount of money, and in return they can collect that debt from the homeowner plus up to 25% interest and fees, that you can't even begin to explain where they come from. And they don't have to, they aren't regulated to do that. And then, so then they now own this debt, and they can charge the homeowner all of these fees and excessive interest. And if they can't pay that debt in a certain amount of time, they can foreclose on the house, and the homeowner loses their whole home. So this is one reason why homeownership for African Americans hasn't been the wealth building tool it's been for whites, because this happens far more often in African American communities. But it doesn't have to be this way either. And, you know, of course, this affects a lot of elderly homeowners more often, or homes that have been in a family for generations, so they don't have a mortgage, where their property taxes are paid through their mortgage payments. So this can be prevented by a local jurisdiction not selling their tax debt to investors, changing their policy to instead collect it in-house by the public, you know, officials who are have to answer to their voters. They can start programs to put off property tax payments until the house is sold. They can provide some property tax reductions to elderly or low-income homeowners. They can help homeowners in a lot of other ways stay in their home and not lose their whole family's, you know, asset just because of a late property tax payment. So that's one example.
You know, Richard, go ahead.
Well, let me add to that just for a bit. You know, you talked before about photographs we have in the book that illustrate these things. There's a photograph in the book of a D.C. auction that the city of D.C., Washington, D.C., was running to auction off foreclosed homes of families whose homes had been seized from them because they fell behind in their property tax payments. And of course, in a period when we have rising property values, people who've lived in their homes for years can no longer afford to live in their own homes because the property taxes increase as the values of their properties increase. And they, you know, many people, those of you who are middle class and own homes probably are used to having your mortgage company deduct your taxes. You might get if you didn't have a mortgage company deducting your taxes, you might get a property tax bill. You put it in a pile with your other bills. You don't really understand its importance. You don't really realize that you're going to lose your home if you don't take care of this right away. And this is something that a local civil rights group could attend to. We could, for example, force the city to notify a charitable organization, United Way, anytime somebody falls behind in their property taxes. And there could be a local community group that went and reached out, knocked on the doors of the people who are falling behind in their property taxes to explain to them what the consequences of this would be. So this is another opportunity for people to get involved and to make a significant difference. All of these make small differences, but there are so many policies like this and programs that local activists could engage in, some of them in providing service, some of them in making demands.
What I appreciate about the book, so let me back up. The person for whom the library is named, Martin King, once talked about the tranquilizing drug of incrementalism. Mm-hmm. And he, like the both of you and many of us here, are fighting for those small victories, because we do believe that a cacophony of small victories might become a symphony of justice. But it's really challenging, you know, you look at this system and you want to blow it up because it causes so much pain and so much death and destruction. I cannot remember the author, but I think he's an economist. He talked about thinking beyond capitalism, how we just get nervous when someone even says ordering our lives beyond capitalism. We know that, as you said, Richard, there is no political will. There's political will to do some things, but not these things. And I won't say that, but if you had a magic wand for a different system, what vision captivates you? I think that we have to have a vision, a city toward which we march. I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, it's a little bit outside of the scope of this book.
Right.
This book's vision is really redressing segregation, taking those small steps. undoing, the many pieces that went into creating segregated communities, sort of attacking piece by piece in our own communities to improve conditions and create more racial equality
Right.
within the confines of the system that we currently live in. Me personally, I would like to see a different system where we don't have to do that, more communal living, more connected, intertwined, interdependent living, but that's not what we wrote about this time.
No, and I appreciate that, because many of us are trying to do, many of the strategies you have in this book will be nourished by it, but the thing that I just want to press toward, I just wonder, housing should be treated as a human right. If this society were what it ought be or claims to be. And so with these approaches and with the lack of political will that you have named and that we see in this progressive city, how do we keep going when the political will is challenging or non-existent, when the ubiquity of NIMBYism is never far? How do we keep going step by step, fight by fight?
I became very hopeful as a result of writing these two books.
Great.
I said before that if it happened by accident, there's nothing we can do about it. If it happened on purpose, we can fix it on purpose. And I don't, I know maybe I'm too old. I don't think of utopias. That's not what keeps me going. What keeps me going is seeing the small victories that people can win if they just get together with their neighbors. And I'm old enough to have been part of the civil rights movement. We organized. You talk about the polarization, the viciousness that's going on in the society, but polarization has two sides. It has two sides. And
what are those sides?
The base of support for racial justice is enormous in this country. And if we focus only on the opposition, we're going to lose an enormous opportunity. There's never been in this country as much understanding of racial inequality as there is today in this country. There's a lot of opposition to it, clearly. But if we only focus on the opposition and don't take advantage of the enormous opportunity that this period gives us, then we're losing an enormous, I'm repeating that, enormous opportunity. And my vision is what I'd like to see is I'd like to see our Constitution enforced. I'd like to see us begin to enforce our Constitution. It's not a utopia, but we could actually do a lot if we just get out of our chairs and out of our homes and meet with our neighbors and create the kinds of committees that could accomplish things that have done so in the past.
Leah, were you going to?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I also came out of writing this book a lot more hopeful than I was when I started. I read Color of Law like many people and felt overwhelmed by the history and the challenges that it left us with, and wasn't sure how we would write about how to address it. And when we talk about political will in the book, we say that there's no national political will for national policy change, but we went, all those interviews we did, we found that political will in communities around the country, and that is being built, and it's not an easy process, but it is happening all across the country, and we've been, going across the country talking about this book, and there's people everywhere tackling these issues in their community and trying to make change. So I find that very hopeful that there is a chance for us to do something about it.
I definitely agree, but I think also the muscular and violent opposition is serious. And the pushback, so you talk about daring to defy. I think about the maroon community amongst Africans who never accepted enslavement and dehumanization, and even those from the very beginning of the trade. Lincoln defying the Supreme Court. There's always a price to be paid in the defiance. I wanted you to amplify the fact that the court is no panacea, that courts are not a panacea, and that the history of the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court is totally on the side of the wealthy property owners and the status, economic and political status quo. Say more about the pushback and daring to defy, because I'm interested in your thinking.
Well, you know, we have a photograph in the book, another one, one you've probably seen, of 4 students in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, sitting in at a lunch counter, illegal, sitting in at a lunch counter to desegregate public accommodations. And the caption of the book says that these 4 students didn't wait for the Supreme Court to tell them what they could and couldn't do. And by the same token, I think we need to return to that mindset, as you just said, summarizing a chapter of the book. The Supreme Court has no legitimacy when it comes to race in this country. It has consistently annihilated the 13th Amendment, which not only abolished slavery, but guaranteed, allegedly, that what has been termed the badges and incidents of slavery, that is, any form of second-class citizenship would be abolished. The 14th Amendment reinforced that. In 1866, Congress passed a law prohibiting discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. In 1968, 102 years later, after the Supreme Court had found that law unconstitutional, the Supreme Court says, whoops, oh, we made a mistake. I guess the 1866 law prohibiting discrimination in housing was a valid exercise under the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. Well, we need to now not wait for the Supreme Court to tell us what we can do. Again, Leah mentioned these columns we're writing. I wrote one last week that was published in The Atlantic about the upcoming Supreme Court decision that will likely prohibit affirmative action in college admissions. You know, we've had affirmative action in college admissions for the last 50 years on a completely fraudulent basis, and civil rights activists have fallen for it. The Supreme Court said it's okay to have affirmative action for the purposes of having diversity in a college class, because if you get black students into colleges, that will give whites a better education. That's not the reason we need affirmative action. We need affirmative action as a remedy for the unconstitutional exclusion of African Americans from American society. And what I said in this article, and we call for it in the book around housing issues, is that if the Supreme Court, as it's likely to do, says you can no longer use race-conscious affirmative action, college presidents should do it anyway. And instead of justifying it on the basis of diversity, they should justify it by explaining how this is remedying unconstitutional behavior that they have an obligation to remedy. And it'll be challenged, and some local court judges will uphold the policy, some will prohibit it, some appellate judges and even Supreme Court justices will dissent, as happened around Plessy v. Ferguson back in 1896, that said separate but equal is perfectly okay. And over time, we will begin to educate the country over the necessity of remedying violations of the Constitution, which still maintain the racial inequality we have today. So that's, you know, Leah's our genius chapter namer, and she named this chapter Dare to Defy. And I think
like
that's what we need to do.
Yeah. So let's hear from these wonderful folks who are sharing the evening with us tonight. Your questions.
Yes, if you have a question, please just raise your hand and David will come around with the mic. And I love you, Washington, D.C., but I will remind you these are questions and not speeches. This is not the venue. Thank you. Yes, right here.
So you've talked a lot about housing and ownership, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about rental housing and how the segregation in terms of rental housing and where it's located, particularly public housing, has kind of impacted that, and what kinds of things should we be doing in those areas?
We'll start, Floyd.
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the things we describe in the book is an ordinance that people that got in Cleveland got the Cleveland City Council to adopt. Many people get evicted as their rents rise, and maintenance is not maintained, and they refuse to pay their rent, or they can't pay their rent as the rents rise, even though they're not being provided with housing that is safe and sanitary and healthy. Well, the ordinance that Cleveland adopted provided a free right to counsel for anybody who is evicted. There was a cutoff for income level. It should be provided for much higher cutoffs than it did, but it's a start. Everything is a start. And they provided a right to counsel for anybody with eviction. But that would be, like I talked about before with the property taxes, it would be meaningless because people wouldn't know that they had a right to a lawyer when they get an eviction notice. So what the ordinance requires is that any landlord who wants to evict a household has to provide a notice not only to the tenant but to the United Way. And the United Way then works with community groups to notify those people and to put them in touch with a free lawyer provided by Cleveland Legal Aid. And the vast majority of people who've taken advantage of this service have either had their evictions reversed or they've received a payment to provide them with safer and more sanitary and healthier housing as a result. Now, a disproportionate share of the people who are eligible for this program are African American. And so it's one of these tiny policies. And that's why we keep on emphasizing there's so many things that people can do. I'm not suggesting that in Washington, D.C., you should make a focus of your action the right to counsel. There might be other things you're in. It doesn't matter, as long as you start somewhere. So that's one policy that we talk about. Rent control and rent regulation varies from place to place, but that's another way of addressing rental issues. You want to add?
Yeah, we have a lot of these. So the low-income housing tax credit is the largest federal subsidy for building low-income rental housing. It's often for the lowest income renters, and so we talk about how this program works, and sometimes developers combine what are called LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit units, with market rate units and call that a mixed income development. And we advocate for creating truly mixed income developments that have not only the low-income tax credit units and market rate, but also middle income housing. We call it missing middle housing, to create a truly mixed income development. Also, the way the LIHTC program works is every state has a plan that tells how they're going to allocate their tax credits to projects, so what they're going to prioritize basically in developments that get this federal subsidy. And many states give priority to projects that are in low-income areas or that have neighborhood support. So that requiring neighborhood support basically means that you're not going to get developments in exclusive suburbs. So this is a way that the low-income housing tax credit then is used, and it further concentrates poor people in segregated areas. And so we advocate for local groups to pressure their state to change their what are called qualified action plans to require more integrated projects and require them to be in higher opportunity areas. So that's one example. We also talk about the Section 8 program and ways that that program can be changed on the local level to allow Section 8 tenants who are low income, disproportionately African American, the opportunity to use their Section 8 rental voucher to live in a high opportunity or high cost, usually predominantly white community. There's a lot of ways the program is designed locally that makes it hard for them to do that or impossible. But there's a lot that can be done locally to prevent that. So those are a couple more rental examples.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been really informative. So I know you talk a lot about organizing in local communities. That seems to obviously be the focus of your book, but with DC being DC, I have to ask, so many of us work in the federal policy space, and so I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of organizing for creating that political will to make some kind of change when it comes to housing policy federally.
Organizing for what? Say that last sentence again.
For federal.
Housing
Oh.
policy federally.
We don't think there's going to be significant change in federal housing policy until there's a much more powerful mass movement for social justice in this country. And the only way to do that is to win small victories that build and that give people confidence in going further. Leah described the land trust in Durham that began when people organized to get a park, a parklet on a block so children could play. And when they won that, they became more confident that they could win something bigger. And I think that's what it's going to take. As I said before, so many of these federal policies are expressed locally and where there's local control. So Leah was just talking about the LIHTC, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. As she said, although the federal government runs this program, states create the rules under which it's implemented, and they require to hold public hearings. All of you should go to the next public hearing here to see how the LIHTC program is being administered here, whether it's giving local communities the right to veto them, because it doesn't want poor people, meaning black people, in their community. They wouldn't be able to get away with that if there were mass presence at the hearings that they hold. And so that's where I think federal policy, as expressed locally, can begin to be attacked.
Hello, first pastor, great job. I'm AME also. The church is proud.
Thank you.
Secondly, for many black people, their lives demand the fierce urgency of now, yet we are constantly being told to move with all deliberate speed. You're from the Bay Area, so I'm going to raise the R word, reparations. California has a reparation task force. San Francisco just put a reparations plan. I would like to know what you think about reparations.
Go ahead.
Our answers might be slightly different, so I'll start. I am heartened and very excited by all of the talk about reparations. I think the fact that we're talking about it as much as we are now, I know it might be more in California than elsewhere, but it's starting. I think that shows that we're beginning to reckon with our past in an honest way, that we do have something to pay reparations for. And I think that that's a positive step. Now, we don't use the term reparations in our book, partly because I think there's a risk to calling a program a reparation, giving a payout, and then thinking we're done. Okay, we've made our repair, we can be done with this. So we prefer the term remedies because we think that we need many, many remedies. Some of them will be wealth redistribution, subsidies, financial assistance, that sort of thing. And some will be policy change. So true reparations also require us to change some policies. So that's what I think about it. What do you think about it?
Well, I agree with most of what Leah said, but I worry that focusing on things that are unattainable prevents us from focusing on things that are attainable. And so I'm not enthusiastic about all the attention that's being paid to reparations without attention being paid to these concrete reforms that could actually make a difference and are achievable. So I agree with the rest of what Leah said, but I hope that, I think that holding out hope for reparations, which is not going to happen, much as it might be a great thing, is going to prevent people from focusing on things that can happen. And that's my concern.
I think are we gonna have time for yeah, my final thoughts. Would you join me in thanking Richard and Leah for their great work? What I would say to that final remark is that we must do both. We must dream of the unattainable while working on this tranquilizing drug called incrementalism. If we take abolition was impossible. Civil rights were impossible. And maybe when I grow up, I will be as hopeful about what is possible in this space as Richard, but I'm not there. I think that when we talk about the Constitution, it is not a broken document. It was designed to produce what it produces. And our citizenship is still in question because you had to amend it and still trying to. So I think that let us move forward incrementally, but I want to express our frustration, but the fact that we cannot stop the incremental work while believing the impossible is possible and being clear, as Derek Bell was, about what this space has been. And hopefully together we'll do something different. Thank you all.